Hello, everyone. Welcome to UMD Media's weekly show, The Edge Panel. The Edge Panel will tackle peace without accountability? Question mark. That is the topic today, but as usual, we'll start what stood out for the panelists. And again, I'm happy to be joined by Miguel Gabisa, Faisal Roble, and Duke Berberich. It's a pleasure to have you back, gentlemen, and it has been a very eventful week. Even today, a lot happened in Ethiopia. So before we go to the topic of the week, peace without accountability, we will go ahead and start with the first section. We are live online, but also this program will be on satellite to the Horn of Africa under Horn Broadcasting Services at YASAT. That is Horn Broadcasting Services, HBS, where a number of medias, including UMD Media, is aired to the Horn of Africa. Gail, we'll start with you today. And what's the highlight for you? I have my own suspicion, but go ahead and share what stood out for you.
Well, you tell me the suspicion and I'll get started.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I know what you're suspecting, and what I have in mind, what stood out for me is what happened today. What is being reported is that some Oromo bishops established an Oromo Holy Synod, which means that they're establishing an independent administration of the churches in Oromia. But that's only because there was prior effort to establish a holy synod for Oromia, which is not independent from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. What happened today is because the three bishops that presided over the event and the meeting that they had in Waliso, so the parish, or I think the diocese of one of the bishops, that's where they had their meeting. They were protected by the Oromia state while they were deliberating on these issues. It's because there were three bishops presiding over the press report. The report on the media, everywhere in the media, is that the Oromo bishops established an independent Holy Synod. I don't think that's what happened here from carefully listening to the press briefing. The three bishops that presided over, at least in the press briefing, they cited one reason for the dramatic and significant action that they had taken. But it should be seen as the beginning of an administrative schism of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, or a split, rather than a declaration of independence by the Oromia bishops. This is much more significant than the Oromia regional government, or the interim Oromia region that is establishing a holy synod. What the bishops stated was that they had established, and that was very clear in the statement. I listened to this. What they're saying is that because the Holy Synod that now administers the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was dominated by 85% dominated by people or bishops from one ethnic group. Because of that domination, and I think there are about 45 bishops in the Holy Synod, and 38 of them come basically from the Amhara ethnic group, and they have immobilized any action. They have stood in the way of reform. They have opposed any appointment of a diverse group of bishops to represent the other ethnic groups, not just the Oromo. So they said they had established a new all-inclusive Holy Synod, the highest body in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and they have started work. That's what they say. So this is basically the beginning of split, a beginning of not if not theological schism, but maybe an administrative or ecclesiastical split of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So that must be seen uh, based on the declaration of the bishops that this is really a significant event that is taking place in Ethiopia. Maybe last year, because the Tigray region had also declared their independence because of the war, that this war that we are talking about and the policies that the PP, the Prosperity Party, had been following uh, has gone deep into the fabric of society, including the church, and has now led to a split. So, but it's not really the fact that the Holy Synod was dominated by the one ethnic group that the three bishops today cited. There is a lot of corruption in the church, in behavior and engaging in behavior unbecoming of bishops, such as bearing a child, which is against the dogma. There is also a lot of embezzlement of church finances and property. The clergy that emanates from that group, that dominates the Holy Synod, they have been engaged in illegal land grab. They just go and grab a piece of land and build church on it, on private property, on public property. Because this is a church, no one goes against them, but it is not all for church or ecclesiastical reasons that they were taking over land. There is a lot of kickback and financial larceny. The church has always enjoyed, we know, some state protection and privilege, but what was happening was beyond the control of the church. It was just a private adventure um, to enrich oneself. So that is part of it. There is also a lot of political corruption in the church. The body known as the Mahabara Kaddusan, which was actually established for reasons other than politics, for the renewal of the church. Once, I guess, one of the leaders was Daniel Kubret, now the prime minister's counselor on social issues. It looks like that party had taken over the church and turned it into a political machine of propaganda and political chicanery. In this, the patriarch had one complaint about how the church had fallen under the control of this group. And the Daniel Kubret, who is emeritus leader of that group, had been a thorn on the side of the sitting patriarch, accusing him of disloyalty to the church and partiality toward one ethnic group. The members of the Holy Synod have prevented the patriarch from speaking once, if you remember, to express his disapproval of the genocide that was going on in Tigray. And he was forced to seek out an American friend to record his voice and then leak it to the public. When the patriarch did that, the Holy Synod, someone who said that represented the Holy Synod, came out on Ethiopian television. The Ethiopian media, government or party media that had prevented the prelate of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church from speaking, now allowed this man to come out and declare that what was leaked and what was said was the private and personal opinion of the patriarch. During the Tigray War, some of these bishops that were members of the Holy Synod have been publicly engaged in aiding and abetting the war and encouraging genocide, blessing tanks, blessing the Fano, and encouraging them to kill Tigrayans. This is recorded. Maybe everybody has heard Abuna Michael of Mikhail of Bahir Dar once came out and he said Ethiopians would prefer being ruled by the devil himself than the TPLF or Tigray. So there is a lot of political corruption. And in Oromia today, in many churches and in many monasteries, the monasteries have become depositories for armaments that the Amhara Fano are distributing and killing Oromos with. So all of this added, the political corruption, the domination now came to the fore, and the bishops have said enough is enough. So it's a bigger issue. It's a bigger issue than the declaration of Oromia's Holy Synod. We will see how this is going to turn. The Patriarch has summoned all the bishops to look into it. I'm not sure that they will be able to overturn the 26 bishops that were appointed, and these are not all Oromos. There were Sente, Ngurage, Ago, even Amhara in it. I don't know if they're going to overturn the appointment. If they cannot accept it, it looks like the bishops that were assembled and declared what they did today are going to go forth. So what we're seeing is really the beginning of a schism in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. In how many years? Maybe since the EOC was established many, many centuries ago.
Thank you, Stan, for that. Given this is still a developing story, there are a number of reactions from different directions, those that are happy. I have seen a lot from Oromo activists expressing their delight, and reactions from the association you mentioned, Mahavar Kandusan, for example, and the Patriarch, His Holiness, in addition to summoning the bishops from all dioceses, he also called the public to be calm and pray as they talk about this. So we'll be following this closely. And Daniel Kabrat, who actually was open in justifying what has been happening to the faithful in Tigray, including the clergy, the looting and destruction of churches on media. He justified saying this is inevitable given Tigray, the forests of churches and monasteries during the war, has came out and reacted to this development as well. Faisal, there was a story we were following last week's H panel in near Jijiga. Maybe if there is any update on that as well, or anything that stood out for you, Faisal.
Well, yeah, as we followed last week, I would say the entire Somali region is in a quasi chaos. And last week we talked about the conflict that rose as a result of a dam that PP Oromia Shimelis Abdisa is forcing through the throats of the Somalis. And I think maybe I'll go back to the roots, but some of the pictures that I shared with you show that exactly, this is only about 10, 15 kilometers from Jigjiga. And whether there are two versions, people like Mustafa gave the green light, $400 million project. Somalis and peasants who live there are saying no. It will displace 30,000 Somalis. It could also damage Jijjiga in the case the dam breaks. It also reduces the water flow to the only river that takes place or goes through Jijjiga. And basically, up to this day, about 30, 35 people have died on both sides. This is the police from the PP Oromia side, and they really obliterated those villages. And if you can see, this is a flat land. This is the same area that Abiy visited during the wheat publicity, and the Somali police were given the order not to do anything, so they watched. So there is an uphill. That's what it says. The police, Somali police, were ordered not to intervene. So it became civilian peasants versus the population. This is something that just happened today, in not that far from the site, in near Jigjiga again, and you can see the gunshots, the live gunshots, and I don't know if that voice sound can...
rasaas noolnool ayay la dhacayaan ciidamada liyu booliska kuwaasoo loo
And now this is the Somali Liu police trying to calm the people and really using live bullets and ammunition against the people. 3 people, 2 ladies, women, mothers, poor mothers, and 1 person are in critical condition as we speak. So we just received this about 2-3 hours ago. And this is about 20 kilometers or so from Jijjiga. Mustafa actually admitted that Fafan region is in crisis. That's what he said in 3 days ago when all the regional leaders were assembled. He distorted the facts, but the nutshell of what he said that can impact Addis Ababa's policy making was he said that Fafan is obliterated and replete with inter-societal, intercommunal conflict. Now, I think that's probably enough in terms of the pictures and as to the incidents that we are talking about, but I tried to trace the root of the bloodshed in the Somali region that has come up in the last few weeks. And the resumption of this low intensity conflict between Somali and Oromo and Somali and Afar are troublesome issues that need to be comprehensively understood, and also we need to have a people-centered solution before things get out of hand. Today there are unmitigated conflicts on both fronts, i.e. Oromo Somali and Somali Afar. Now, what are the issues and how do we explain this? In the case of the Afar Somali conflict, 3 districts that are populated by Somalis have been claimed by Afar since the Tigray war started. This claim was new. And because of Afar's strategic alliance with Aret Kilo in the last 2 years since the inception of the Tigray war, basically Afar leaders felt that they have a muscle that they can flex, and they basically moved without any permit. 3 Somali districts took over. Up to this day, we are registering that about 4,000 Somalis have been reportedly killed in the Somali districts, and Afar is today moved us into the Somali region deep, about 150 kilometers. 2 districts that were established to quell the Somali population that were evicted are again taken over by the Afar in the last few days. In a nutshell, you can say the issue is a government and politically engineered, which is undoing the historical relationship between the 2 people that are both Muslims and lived together for centuries, and they also live together in Djibouti. And probably at my conclusion, I can talk about the implications of this. In the more troublesome Somali-Oromo conflict, let me recognize that Eastern and Southern Oromia and Somalis have roots, deep-rooted relationships that go back to 3 or 4 centuries at minimum, and produced what I call geographic areas that have no identity, as well as identities that have been blurred. In those areas, really the Somalo-Oromo identity have, kind of joined, and at times you cannot tell who is who. In the era of Mengistu Haile Mariam and Haile Selassie time, these geographies were largely peaceful, and Somali and Oromo, often bilingual on both sides, amicably coexisted under common oppression that they shared. No geographies were contested, therefore their cohesion survived for centuries. As much as social networks such as cross-cultural marriages, religious communality, and the art of the 2 nations joined at the hips, commerce became fluid and fully integrated. In the city of Dredaw, for example, many people remember it as the city where the late, great Ali Birra cut his teeth for music. Ali, an Oromo icon, was one of the stars of the Afranqalla band. In addition to Ali, however, Saeed Sheikhash was a Somali singer who was not only one of the founders, but also one of the big stars of that band. It was an Oromo Somali band. I recall Ali Birra as both a Somali and an Oromo, And as a young boy, I used to see him singing both in Somali and in Afan Oromos in Jijjiga weddings. I even recall the families with whom he lived. They were distantly related to me. Then what happened? What really happened to the Somalo-Oromo relationship that survived centuries? Well, the year of 1991 and a sweeping change came with what many of us thought to be a good move, but turned for Somalis a bad omen. EPRDF took power. Power resided mainly in the hands of TPLF, OPDO, and Amara Democratic Front. The rest, Ethiopians, were nicknamed Agar, and those that are political peons, small people, they were considered. Or in the words of Ralph Ellison, America's preeminent writer, they were invisible niggers. The politics of robbing Peter to reward Paul in the form of land transfers came into play. And that politics impacted Somali-Oromo relationship negatively. OPDO politicians unfortunately used their newly found political power to break up the Somalo-Oromo social cohesion and started an aggressive and uncontrollable land grab. In a sham referendum in 2004, Somalis say they lost over 300 districts that belonged to Somali residents prior to the referendum. Outside the ranks of politicians, all of whom have no agency in the Somali region, will tell you, every Somali politician will tell you in private that they are only part of Ethiopian because of the brutal rule hanging over their neck. If they had the choice, today they will exit from the empire. Now, the current conflict is over some of the portions that Somalis say the referendum did not take away from them or did not move it to Kilil 4. The leftover is what they are fighting over. About a year ago, Shimalis Abisa of PP surveyed a place only about 10 kilometers to the north of Jijjiga, a place called Marar, which is within the Somali region. Mr. Shimalis' administration has proposed a dam to the tune of 400 million birr. According to Addis Standard yesterday, even ministers in the Somali region government said that what Shimalis and his administration are doing is illegal. This is what they told to Addis Standard. These are the ministers. Now, in public speaking, the silent Somali majority in private are saying Minister Abiy is behind all this. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. But whichever way you slice it, there is an illegal and heavy hand of Shimalis heavily weighing on Somalis. The regional president of the Somali region is suffering from a self-imposed conundrum. On the one hand, he sees the legitimacy of the grievance of his people from city region to Tuligule to Liban zone and the wanton bloodshed by those that command more political agency than Somalis do. In Marar, which is part of Tuligule district, especially special forces from Oromia plus federal forces have been fighting against civilians and local farmers. Death toll as of today is 35 people on both sides. And brothers are killing brothers in this area. On the other hand, the formerly hand-picked president, all of them suffered from the same fate. Mustafa is trying to prove now to the Oromo leadership, because in the past he has been so closely affiliated with Amhara ultra-nationalists. One way he's trying to strike favor with the Oromo leadership is not to really stand up for what's right, and at least at minimum mediate the conflict that's brewing in his region. He has been silent and he has been blaming the poor peasants. In my closing remarks later on, I'll say a few words about how this phenomena, losing or destroying Somalo-Oromo cohesion, will impact the coexistence of the two people in the Horn of Africa. It may also impact regionally, including Somaliland and Puntland, and I will say a few words later on that. The most important thing is the same army that's killing Oromo brothers in the Oromo region all the way from Walaga to Bale are also killing Somalis. This is not a conflict between the Somali masses and the Oromo people, but it is a bad policy carried by people like Shimalis Abdissa, who does not understand the historical nature of the relationship of the two people. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. For those who are wondering, while what's happened in Oromia today and the Somali Oromia, the Somali Afar, everyone else, the Prime Minister was today overseeing the military training show that he posted on his Telegram.
Field Marshal Burhanu Jula ሁለተኛው ሁልጊዜም ለባንዲራና ለመለዮ የማይዛነፍ አቋም ያለው ኃይል መሆን የምናስበውን ልማት ቢሊየንስ መጥተው የሚያዩበት ሰፈር እንዲሆን
We'll maybe touch on that later. Duke, what stood out for you? What is the highlight? I know many of our viewers also know what your focus is, but let's hear it from you.
Yeah. I think that probably the highlight that stood out was more reports of Eritrean soldiers leaving Tigray. I don't know if they're leaving one by one or not, but it seems like every week we have new reports. But I've had some personal confirmation that this seems to be what's happening. At least they're being redeployed, hopefully to Eritrea, but I'll believe it when I see it. And it's very important that that's happening right now because humanitarian aid is not getting past Eritrean soldiers. It's not getting past Ethiopian soldiers in every case, but it's certainly not getting past Eritrean soldiers. The last update came out about food distribution. It was higher than it had been maybe 6 months ago. There's been certainly improvement. But if you look at this chart, you'll see what it looked like the 2 weeks leading up to the cessation of hostilities, or I'm sorry, the 2 months leading up to the cessation of hostilities, and then the 2 months after. The first chart, the first bar there, that's when the Tigrayans held most of the territory in Northwest and Central. There were still, even in September, there were some towns that had already been taken. In October, certainly more so, but that was as the invasion was bearing down on the capital, as it was closing in on the capital. This was still, this many people were still able to get food. That, if you see the second one, that's what's happened since then. This area is firmly in control of the federal government, yet aid is not being distributed, and these are people that need it very desperately. These are people that have been displaced, families have been displaced more than once with nothing, but they have no access to their crops. They have no access to livestock. Most of that's been stolen. They are in dire need of food. They need food. They need medicine. They need shelter in many cases. That hasn't gotten anywhere. There is the idea that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken yesterday talked about the significant progress that's been happening. All of the progress that happens seems to be progress that excludes the people of Tigray, and I'm assuming that we will get into that in a little bit. The last update was a little bit more promising as far as distribution. It's happening in some places of the Central Zone. But the idea that we are 2.5 months since unfettered humanitarian access was promised in Tigray and still not reaching places in the Central Zone is absurd and appalling. Tigray is not a huge region. It's not, there are no 2 points of Tigray that are 2 months away from each other. This food should be getting to people who need it. And everything right now, medicine's very important, shelter's very important, transitional justice is very important, disarmament, demobilization, all of that stuff is important, but food is absolutely important right now. There was a report that they were, that some agricultural things were distributed last month or a month before, and the farmers had to sell them to buy food for their family. If you don't have food, you don't have anything. My grandmother grew up during the Depression. She used to say, if you're hungry, that's all you are, is hungry. It's a serious problem. They have to get food to the people who need it. That has to be, there can be no question about that objective. That's not political. That's not, there's no give or take. Nobody can negotiate that away. That has to absolutely happen. It's happening at a snail's pace, and it is something that nobody on the US side or on the UN side is talking about. They're all pretending that things are going very well, and they're not going very well. And that alarms me. Even though we are seeing minor progress, it's alarming that everybody is perfectly willing, from the Secretary General to the UN to Samantha Power, who had been outspoken in the past. Everybody is pretending everything's going okay, and it's not. And that's very alarming. But we'll see how it looks in the future. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Doc, for that update. It's very, very critical that the civilian humanitarian issues are not forgotten. And that takes us to the topic, peace without accountability. And the starting point for this topic is what Bloomberg reported this week. And it's on the international human rights experts on Ethiopia. And they let me just show this to our audience. They talked about how they want to Ethiopia to work with them or cooperate in terms of the their probe. And as we remember, Ethiopia last year, in addition to opposing the establishment of this commission, it also drafted a proposal for defunding it. And it happened in April, and then in December, in both at both times, it failed to achieve that. So that body continues, and we know also the Prime Minister talked to TPLF officials that they can continue governing Tigray if they cooperate in helping him, this body or any other body, not caution him or not probe or continue with this probe and so on. But in this report from Bloomberg, Simon Marks writes that the body wants to even consider or specifically look at how Eritrea or the role of Eritrea in all this and so on. So we want to start with that. What are we reading both in this report, which says the UN Commission's current investigations will focus in much more depth about the role of Eritrea forces played in the conflict, according to one of the commissioners, the American Ratner. Let's start with this, Gail. What do you make of this peace that now is maybe close to 80 days since it was signed in Pretoria? And we haven't seen any serious consideration for accountability, both from Mekelle and Addis Ababa. Estelle? I think you are muted, or let me see. Yeah, I see that you are muted. Okay, now it should work.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there is one line in the agreement, in the Pretoria Agreement, that refers to accountability, at least the need for accountability. And I think the Ethiopian government has also taken a pro forma step that the Minister of Justice has spoken about instituting a tribunal or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or something, but I'm not clear about what he was saying. But they have also followed through on the Ethiopian side. The reason that the Ethiopian government has followed through with the agreement with respect to transitional justice is to forestall and then prevent the UN Commission to do its work, an independent fact-finding mission to the atrocities that were committed in Tigray. The allegations are the crimes against humanity have been committed, war crimes have been committed. In general, there is a human rights violations of grand proportions that were committed in the Tigray war. Now, one of the sides that was accused of committing these atrocity crimes is the Ethiopian government itself. When you are one of the accused, it's very difficult to see that you would undertake a credible and a genuine fact-finding investigation to establish what happened. The allegations are, as I just named, crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, crimes against the rules of war, and human rights violations in general. If the Ethiopian government is one of the parties to the war, it will not be able to conduct the investigation, but the Ethiopian government is really determined to do that. We have seen that twice in the UN body to deny the funding for the group. It has also denied access to Tigray. Now that there is peace, it's incumbent on the Ethiopian government to allow it, but they're determined. Because they have lost on the international stage twice, now they have instituted their own investigation, and that's what they're going to say, that we're going to carry the investigations, so we don't need any outside interference. They will probably invoke sovereignty and other international rules. But look, what happened in Tigray is not law enforcement. The war is not a war between the central government and the Tigray government. This war has we have seen in many forces involved, including the Eritreans, the UAE, Turkey, even Iran, Sudan, Somalia. So basically, this is an international, a regional war, regional conflict, if it is not an international war, given that many other countries were basically directly involved. When I say directly involved, the Turkish government did not simply sell drones to them, they sent specialists with them. So they are directly involved in the war. So it's either a regional war or maybe an international war that requires international investigation. I think the UN body, even the General Assembly, is aware of this, and that's why they rejected the Ethiopian government's proposal to not fund the commission. If the UN body does not insist, and other international forces do not insist that this commission does its job, investigate what happened in Tigray and what is happening all over Ethiopia, and establish the facts, the implication is far-reaching than simply turning your back against the victims of this war. What it means is that it would give green light to all armed forces, not just in Ethiopia, not just in Africa, but in the entire world, that impunity is the rule, that you can kill anybody, you can conduct genocide, you can commit crimes against humanity and all kinds of atrocity crimes, you can get away with it. So the implication is not going to be limited to Ethiopia. It's going to have an implication that the UN body itself cannot control, or the international community itself cannot control. Secondly, this is what happened in Tigray, in my mind, and many of us, of course, know what happened. It's a violation of international law, the rules of war. It's also a violation of international human rights, international humanitarian law. Food was used as a weapon, which is the violation of international humanitarian law. The siege was basically a violation. All of this that we know, but the experts must establish after their fact-finding mission. If this doesn't happen, if anybody, a state party or anybody else, could get away with violation of international law and a violation of international humanitarian law. There is nothing to protect in the world. The architecture of peace and security that is based on international norms and international law, if it cannot be protected by the international community, there will be no architecture of peace and security in the world. It will be a day that anyone can do whatever they want to do. It gives license. This is serious, and the Ethiopian government cannot do it. The Ethiopian government cannot investigate itself. The Ethiopian government cannot investigate Eritrea. It doesn't even have any control over the behavior of Eritrean forces. It is under international pressure that the Eritreans are leaving, and I'm not even sure that they're leaving. I cannot be sure that they're leaving. They could put people on trucks and goods on trucks and then move over the border to Eritrea. But who knows? Who knows who is leaving? There is no there is no system of knowing who is actually leaving. They could put anybody on trucks and move them and then say that Eritrea had left. That cannot be tolerated or should not be tolerated by the international community. And it cannot be left to the Ethiopian government to investigate itself. It's one of the criminals. And I hope that the Secretary Blinken, that now publicly mentioned the issue in Oromia with him, but also encourage them to follow through in the agreement, encourage them to implement it. But I hope that the international community, the US and the EU, keep on insisting on this accountability measure. Otherwise, there will be no resolution to the conflict that Faisal was talking about, that this country is going to be a bloodland. That's what it's going to be for foreseeable time. There cannot be peace this time. There cannot be peace, sustainable peace. There cannot be peace without accountability. On that front, I hope they hold the line. It's as important as peace in the world is to carry on with this investigation.
Thank you, Skel. On that, on Eritrean leaving, Duke mentioned, and Skel also, yes, the Secretary Blinken, he mentioned also regarding his talk with the Prime Minister, the ongoing withdrawal of Eritrean troops is a critical step in securing hope and peace. But what we see from the ground, this is Hapton Barhe, who is in Tigray, a very active, he was part of the TDF as well. And he was reporting within hours after Secretary Blinken mentioned that. He says Eritrean troops are still present in Tigray cities, Adwa, Aksum, Shire, Shararo, and Humera, and saying tens of thousands of Eritrean troops withdrew from some Eritrean Tigray cities last Friday, and we demand their complete withdrawal from every inch of Tigray's territory. And he showed another report to GAT Media is also how those who were on buses and troops were using some provocative mentions in terms of what they say achieved in Tigray. And I want to go to Faisal on the same question of accountability. And again, we're talking about Tigray, and we are talking about war in Oromia, we're talking about Somalia, what's happening in Somalia. And I showed this picture, the Prime Minister, again, doing what he usually does. What is your take in terms of what this means and how Maqala is seeing all this? Because when UMD Media approached officials within the TPLF regarding the concurrently requirement about handing over the heavy weapons that they did, maybe 10 days or 2 weeks ago, we couldn't get the answer why they were doing it without Eritrea withdrawing and Amhara force withdrawing. So what is your reading of the whole situation of peace without accountability?
Yeah, I think Skel really touched the framework of what this accountability is, and I could feel and share his pessimism in terms of what would happen and how the issue is about to be diluted. The UN Commissioner Mohammed and the other one used. Basically, they are saying Ethiopia already has a process that it's set up, and we will help Ethiopia to work within that framework. And they say we have experience to do transitional justice, and it shouldn't only focus on what happened in the past. I mean, here you have Iskeel eloquently describing the magnitude of this. 600,000 people dead, 3-4 countries participating directly, the internationality aspect of this war. I mean, it's huge. And for them to say the panel won't be fixated on something that has happened in the last 2 years, but see itself as a mechanism that we can help prevent. How do you help prevent what's going to happen in Oromia, or probably in Afar, or in Somalia, or in Sidama? It's happening already in Oromia in a big way. How do you prevent if you don't have accountability checklist? They don't have it. So they probably, this is my fear. And there are many factors that are involved in that fear, in addition to what Iskeel described. Actors are at this point in time the UN, the Western countries, primarily the United States of America, and TPLF. I'll put Eritrea aside. What does America want? For the last 6-8 months, America has toned down its concern about accountability and death and mayhem and hunger. I mean, Duke just shared with us, and they have this data probably before Duke had it, but they are still, so America wants as much as possible to put this issue a blanket, and they will reward anybody who is willing to work with them to make sure that issue don't come to the surface. And who are those people that America would reward if the issue can be quote unquote managed? The UN is one. TPLF could even be another one that they will tell and say, tone it down. And the Ethiopian government is another one. From what we are seeing, Abiy and his team are in no way prepared to see accountability. Actually, they are doubling it down. The new assignment and promotion and appointment officially given to Daniel Kibret is a doubling down on what had happened. They literally rewarded the man I called a person who was giving religious justification for, weeding out, quote unquote, the weed and cutting the cancer, quote unquote, so that nothing like them will ever be born. That person, who is probably in any international regulation, even if you just evaluate the rhetoric that he's using, is probably somebody who has been accountable. I just listened yesterday, the Radio Lab on NPR, where they established a mock Supreme Court to see what had happened in the world, and they pick up Ethiopia. And they look at what had happened through the Facebook. And basically, they are because the people whom they contacted were people, as Iskeel was probably mentioning in relation to the church, people whom we call the white privilege, the Ethiopian privilege. They picked that, and guess what? The person they are featuring to slaughter, if that Supreme Court was about to become reality, our own Jawar Mohammed. And I sent the link to him, and I said, watch out. Basically, of all the things that had happened in Ethiopia, the fall guy that internationally mock Supreme Court picks up is somebody who was fighting for the rights of his people and who was advocating for it. Here is the lopsided justice that we see in Ethiopia, and I will share with you guys later on that. But I think I don't expect Abiy at this point in time to be ready for accountability. I don't expect the UN to push the envelope to find accountability. We see TPLF being quiet. And if you recall in this media a long time ago, I kind of not fantasized it, but hypothesized a day where probably TPLF would be running after those whom they will label radical Tigranians, who will say this is not enough. I think that I hope we don't see that, but that's something we can see. So I think I agree with the scale is, overall, the only thing I like to say with respect to transitional justice and reconciliation, the African experience we have are South Africa and Rwanda. In both cases, the people who were victimized came to the power. I think Scale touched it and said, how can you ask the perpetrator to be the judge? In South Africa, once Mandela became the power, he agreed to the reconciliation, and they were on the power seat. In Rwanda, it's the same thing. Tutsis came, and they will no longer be depending on outsider to be their judge. In Ethiopia, it's the reverse. The perpetrators with international acquiescence and agreement are the judges. And Tigrania people, as well as Oromo and other Ethiopians, should not expect any accountability from this, in my opinion, unless something changes.
Great, thank you, Faisal, for that. And Duke, I want to come to you and with the international US lens as well. So we have also read that the US had appointed a new ambassador to Addis, and many are asking the question, will this ambassador, once approved, will he have any priority in terms of peace, war, or will that be, in bringing back Ethiopia to AGOA, all that, and so on? So what is your take how Secretary Blinken is formulating his statement about his call to the Prime Minister, and significant progress is what he's mentioning here. And many on the ground would, beg to differ, but what's your take?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely disgraceful. Particularly in the case of human rights, how the U.S. State Department, how the United States has handled themselves in this. If you guys remember all the way back, there was a New York Times article that showed that the Department of State had a report, an internal report about ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray from January of 2021. This would have been like the first. It would either have had to have been something that the State Department had started before Anthony Blinken came on, or it would have had to have been a day one or week one thing that they did. This would have had to be the first. And once it became out there that this report was available, it was internally available, never made public, that talked about ethnic cleansing. He went before Congress and told him that there was ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray. Nobody did anything about it. Almost a year later, you saw the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International joint report talking about ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray, and Secretary Blinken had just the humiliating experience of having to feign surprise and grave concern that this was still happening. He knew about it for 10 months. He did nothing, and it was still happening. With the more recent invasion, and of course, this was not confined to Western Tigray. This was taking place all over Tigray, as so many subsequent reports, independent investigations would confirm. This has been happening. They've been downplaying this from day one. This is a country, the United States is supposed to be this country that are talking about social justice and feminism and all of these high moral, concepts that we should all be on board behind. But they've ignored the widespread sexual violence against Tigrayan civilians. They've ignored the siege. They've ignored ethnic cleansing. I have no idea what it would take for them to actually do anything, for them to actually push for this, and to do anything other than lightly defend the independent commission at the UN from being defunded for the third time or the second time that they've tried to do this. When they released their report in September, and they had a hearing about it at the General Assembly, where about 15 countries stood up to say, well, yes, these things are bad in theory. Conflict-related sexual violence is bad, but we're going to, both sides should restrain themselves. Blah blah blah. Nothing. There's been no action. I'm honestly, I mean, I know it gives a bad impression to the Ethiopian government when these things come out, but I don't know what they're really afraid of, because the United States won't act, Europe won't act, the UN won't act. I mean, if you leave it up to the UN, they'll partner with a federal with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which is not independent. They have restrictions on what they can say, what they can't say, who they can blame. They're beholden to the Congress of Ethiopia. It's not an independent thing. And to Faisal's point, when we're talking about the victor of the war being the one to put together some sort of accountability, that usually doesn't happen. You usually don't have accountability. What you usually have is everything getting swept under the rug. And to have 2 months of peace and not have journalist access, not have independent observers, not to have human rights observers or investigators allowed in, what did they need those 2 months for? What have they been doing for 2 months that nobody could come in, nobody could see what they were doing for 2 months? It suggests that they were cleaning up, that they were destroying evidence, that they were making sure that if somebody did get in, they wouldn't see what has been happening for the past 2 years. And to Professor Eskil's point, this does not stop. This can't be contained. This can't be contained to Tigray. It'll happen. It has happened throughout Ethiopia, where the rights of individual civilians, human beings, basic rights, not to be detained illegally, not to have their neighborhood burned down because somebody thinks that one of them is involved in a armed group, not to have these horrible, horrific atrocities committed against them. Those have been violated. And it will not be confined to Ethiopia, because every tin pot dictator will look at this and say, that's all you have to do to beat the United States. That's all you have to do to beat the UN. That's all you have to do to beat the entire human rights framework, is to say, no, you can't go in. You can't look there. That's all you have to do. Why didn't we think of this? Why didn't we think of this sooner? I don't know if we would have let this happen 10 years ago. I remember Samantha Power, when she was the ambassador for the UN, she spoke passionately about what was happening in Aleppo, Syria, which was horrible. The horrible human rights atrocities that were happening there. She found her voice to speak on that. I don't know why she's not speaking now. I would assume that the Secretary of State has clamped down on anybody deviating from the narrative of, let's just make sure everything is fine. Hopefully we can do business in the future. Let's just see if we can dial the clock back, 2 years, 3 years. But that doesn't work. That doesn't work because people have been traumatized. People can't forget what's happened to them. It stands in the way of peace. It stands in the way of actually being able to move forward. I don't think the Ethiopian government has any plans. I mean, you certainly can't trust the Ethiopian government to handle their own human rights investigation. Of course, as been pointed out, they are a major culprit. The other accused human rights violator, the most egregious one, was brought on the invitation. If the Ethiopian government would have not liked what Eritrea was doing in Tigray, they would have said something about it. They haven't yet. It's a disgrace that the United States and that the UN has become like a broken fire extinguisher. It's the most dangerous thing in the world. It's okay not to have a fire extinguisher, but to have a broken one gets people killed. The fact that we claim to be human rights defenders, that the UN claims to be a human rights defender, that the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor claims that this is what they're doing, this is their mission, and to ignore what's happening in Tigray is disgraceful, and it's dangerous. And then this guy was right. This is not going to stop. This is to do it and cover it up this poorly, which the Ethiopian government has never been able to get their stuff together when it comes to covering up what's happening. It is a blueprint. They're teaching a class on it's genocide for dummies. They're teaching a class on how to do this. And it's a sad state of affairs. And that's where America's always had a problem with not being able to confront our allies when it comes to this. Ethiopia didn't even have to pretend to be an ally throughout all this. They just have to pretend that they're going to come back if we let them off the hook for all of this. And it looks like that's what it's headed towards. It's a very sad day. It's a sad day for the UN. It's a sad day for the African Union also, by the way, who had an investigation about this from the beginning and it's done nothing on it, although they also renewed their useless investigation. It's just, it's a sad day. It shows where we are with human rights, is that if you do not have control of a government, you do not have representation in multilateralism. You don't have a prayer of justice. And that is something that is not going to be able to stand for very long. People will not stand for that very long. It's something that is going to come back and bite us. We're pushing this down the road. And I'm horribly embarrassed by the posture that the United States has taken in this.
Thank you, Duke, for that. To your point, we have to remind our viewers, it's the same Blinken in March 2021, to be specific, reported by CNN on March 10, 2021, he said, acts of ethnic cleansing committed in Western Tigray. And Western Tigray is still where we don't know a lot about, and it has been ignored by Blinken himself. So this is important to note. Once you say ethnic cleansing is committed, then you should, the expectation is that they will follow through, but they don't seem to do that. So, gentlemen, let's go to the final one. We have a very limited time, as we will also air this on satellite, and we are limited with the time they give us. So, Skell, your final thoughts of the day.
Yeah, I think that there are two things that we're talking about today. I think when authoritarian governments, despots are overthrown, like Faisal was saying, there will be transitional justice to transition from the dictatorship to some kind of participatory democracy. That they can do. Here we're talking about, and as I was saying, what we're talking about was basically a war, a regional war that happened. So it cannot be even characterized as transitional justice, because there is no transition that is going on in Ethiopia right now. If there is transition, it's not to democracy, but to autocracy. And autocracies do not administer justice. They actually perpetuate justice. What happened in Ethiopia, what is happening in Ethiopia, what happened in Tigray is war, and crimes have been committed in the context of war, which I characterize as a regional war if it's not an international war. If this was really about transitional justice, that about the crimes that were committed by the Ethiopian government all over Ethiopia, that's another matter. It's about transition. It's about political transition. This is not what it is. This is about protecting, as I was saying earlier, about protecting the architecture of peace and security that prevents war in this world, wars between countries or with civil wars themselves, to prevent it. So it is about truth seeking. It's about prosecuting international criminals. It's about reparation. It's about protection of the people, women and children. It's about preventing the same kind of crisis or war or violations of human rights from recurring, not just in Ethiopia, but everywhere else. Wherever there is conflict, whether that conflict is between two countries or a civil war within one country, the goal must be the goal of justice. And in this case, what we're talking about is accountability. Accountability for those who have committed violations against humanity. That's what it is. Violations or crimes against humanity. Violations of the rules of war. So that has implication much beyond any political transition in Ethiopia. So this is for the international community. This is not about internal matters. This is about international norms. This is about preventing the cause, preventing war conflicts from occurring, and wherever they occur, preventing the atrocity crimes that happen in the context of war. That's why it is incumbent on the international community to take matters into their own hands for their own sake, not only for the victims, but to make sure that these kinds of atrocities do not happen again. It's to prevent it from recurring again. That's what the purpose is. So the accountability issue is not about transitional justice per se. It is about preventing these kinds of rape, pillaging, killing with impunity, all of that in the context of a regional war. It is up to their responsibility. They must take their responsibility seriously. Otherwise, it will be a field day for dictators to declare war, do whatever they want to do, not only in their own country, but other countries. But look, this is Isaias's war. This is Isaias's war. He is the one that commanded this war. He is the one that prosecuted the war. It is from Eritrea that Tigray was attacked. That means the worst dictator, the type of Isaias in this world, will have now the green light to do whatever they do if the international community does not stop. That's why I kept emphasizing that, and that's probably what my last message would be.
Thank you, Michael, for that. And this is the September 2022 report from the Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, where they say the language used in the widespread acts of rape and sexual violence against Tigrayan women and girls has suggested an intent to destroy the Tigrayan ethnicity. So this is a commission that Ethiopia has tried more than once to disband or defund at the UN level. Faisal, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think with all that quotes and proof that the world seems to be walking back on its words, whether it's Blinken or the United Nations Commission of Human Rights, because I think, rarely does the UN change its policy towards a given country based on human rights. If it's Iran, yes. If it is Zimbabwe under Mugabe, yes. But somebody that they think they can bring back to the fold, especially at a time when the Cold War or semi-Cold War seems to be coming back, the US would put the human rights, as much as we discussed it beautifully, and I really like how we made our case here. But my hope for the US and UN is nothing but a shadow image of the US. I don't think they will move it, but I think we'll keep knocking on the door by just repeating the facts that we have presented today. I think in my case, the burning in the East is also sinister politics that PP is doing with the intensification of OLA and the fact that OLA is no longer what they call Shene or containable bandits, and OLA is really coming with a liberation form that can even put the National Defense Force its place. I think in addition to military prowess, Abiy and his team are trying to utilize other political social engineering. One of the political social engineering, as I said, is to try to see if they can minimize Ola's impact on eastern and southern Oromia. Historically, Bale region has been a bastion for Oromo liberation movements, and one is Bale, Arsi, and Harar pick up the weapons and join the intellectual aspect of Oromia, which comes mainly from Walaga and Shawa, then it would be unstoppable. I think one way Abiy and his team are trying to stop that wave of Ola taking a big shape is to create a fake conflict with Somalis and Oromos who are naturally allies. As I said last week, Oromo cannot be put under siege. Somali businessmen probably will deal with Oromo Liberation Front and Ola in terms of fuel and what have you. That's an open border. And so that is one thing. What you see in Jigjiga is not really a benign thing or people fighting each other. It's politically engineered. And this is not the first time. It has always been there. Remember, people, previous OPDO leader is calling anytime there is some conflict with the Somali, that Al-Shabaab is coming to Jigjiga, what have you. So I think that's a tired politics, but it's a sinister political equation that's played by Aret Kilo. I think they are underestimating the damage that they are doing to the peoples of Somalis and Oromo. Somalis and Oromos live together in Kenya. They live together in Somaliland. 200,000+ Oromos live in Somaliland. And the kids who have grown up there speak fluent Somali as much as I do. You will be surprised. They live in Puntland, and they live, of course, inside Ethiopia together or in proximity. Even in Kenya, they gravitate to each other, and the Aret Kilo political engineering and social engineering that they are playing will also have repercussion beyond our current borders in Ethiopia. And I think, how do we stop this? I think there's a long term and a short term. I think the short term should be Somalis and Oromo intellectuals who are against the war, both in Tigray as well as in Oromia, should also address this issue to the extent possible and work together. That's the short term. The longer term would be some kind of change, at least a minimum policy change in Aret Kilo, which has been a frustrating effort on most of us, because we have seen in Tigray things haven't changed easily, and in Oromia things are getting worse. I don't know how Aret Kilo will change its policy of political engineering to pit Somalis in, but it is an intentional war. It's an intentional conflict engineered by Aret Kilo, and we need to pay attention to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faisal, for that. Duke, final thoughts of the day.
Yeah, just briefly. This is why I think nobody's ever tried to off-ramp genocide. This is what we're looking at. This is a controlled, managed drawdown of crimes against humanity and genocide, and it's breaking new ground as far as I've ever seen. I mean, of course, I've seen atrocities happen with impunity. I mean, I live in a country that was built on atrocities with impunity. But this is not a model. I'm so worried that the United States is going to look at this as a success, as the war stopped or the violence stopped, and it was just confined then to the civilians, and that this was some sort of success, it's some model to build on, because I have not seen a lot of self-reflection when it comes to the Department of State. It's something I observed in the culture of Department of State, that nobody ever makes a mistake until they stand up and say, I made a mistake. That is a very difficult mindset to do anything good with, to make any progress with. And if we continue this sort of, I mean, I see the reintegration piece is they're starting to talk about, they've been talking about DDR for a long time. And I've said that, well, we don't have reintegration because you should just call it DD at this point, but they're starting to talk about that. And of course, they're going to come up with some program that's called reintegration. Of course, it's going to have some components, and of course, somebody from the UN is going to sign off on it. but it's going to be crap. It's going to be nonsense. It's not going to have any impact. It's not going to work for the people that it needs to work for. And so then we're left with this idea of, are these things really unnecessary? Is accountability really unnecessary for peace? Because we're acting like it is. I mean, not the people on this panel, of course, but the United States is acting like you can sort of flub these things. You can pretend to do accountability. You can pretend to lift a blockade. You can pretend to have demobilization, but it doesn't actually have to happen. And everything about peace building will tell you that no, these things are important. Reconciliation is important. Reconciliation needs justice. There needs to be a transparent process that may not be completely transparent, but there has to be an element of it that's transparent that people can see, and people can see that their grievances are being taken seriously, that they're being redressed, even if it's not as serious as they want, even if they don't get everything they want to participate, to have this be an honest, good faith effort is important, or at least it was. It's supposed to be important. It seems like the United States is tinkering around with the idea of maybe it's not important. Maybe none of these things are important. Maybe the only thing is important is to get people to turn over their heavy weapons, and then we can just go from there. I think this is the most dangerous experiment in peace building that I've seen in a career of peace building. It's heartbreaking to see it being attempted, and I don't think it's going to succeed. And that's very frightening, because what happens next? What happens if there's a resurgence of violence? What happens if Tigrayan civilians continue to be dehumanized when it comes to important things, aid, when it comes to justice, when it comes to freedom? What happens when that continues? What happens when that continues in Oromia? What happens when that continues in the Somali region? What happens when these things spread? We have no idea. We have no idea what will happen if Ethiopia implodes on itself. And that is something that I'm very frightened of. But I think that this is the way the United States has moved into this direction of encouraging some sort of performative progress. And I am worried that is something that fuels these unending wars that we see happen with a considerable amount of participation from the West. Maybe not so much in the way that a lot of the conspiracy theorists think, but we manage these wars, and we're ineffective, and I'm worried that we're fueling them.
Great, thank you, Duke. And that ends our show today. Definitely from what happened today in Oromia, from what's happening very close to Jigjiga, and the Tigray peace agreement with Addis Ababa. We will follow that up as things develop. For today, thank you very much for your time and for your insight as usual. Good night. You have been following live UMD's Media's weekly show H Panel, and on satellite on Yasat, that's under Horn Broadcasting Services. So thank you for following us today, and we'll come back with yet another episode of H Panel next week, Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Today we had a special time that we had to do it at 8 p.m., but it will be back on 7 p.m. on Sunday next week. Good night. Bye.